One dimension of pastoral systems is boundaries, and I mentioned before that territorial areas may be held by groups without necessarily worrying about a boundary in the sense of a line on a map that we're very accustomed to. But they're very aware of the other group, and they will monitor it, and they will basically defend a general boundary region. So the creation of states with very strict frontiers has introduced a fascinating and important dimension into the relationship between different pastoral groups. The boundary between Tanzania and Kenya, as one can look at on the map, divided the Maasai in half. And what they did was they tried to push some of the territorial sections that I mentioned up and say, you belong in Kenya or you belong in Tanzania. There are a couple that straddle the border, in particular the Loita Maasai in the highlands, where you have Loita and then you have the Loitas who are living in Loliondo in Tanzania. So that whole process of creating that line has created a dynamic of a certain sort. I would also draw the parallel to the creation of the boundary between Ethiopia and Kenya. Those are the two boundaries that I've looked at the most carefully. There are no obvious reasons why the boundaries are where they are. They could be somewhere else. There's no natural reason. There's no river. There's no particular highland. We're told that Queen Victoria ceded a portion of Mount Kilimanjaro to her nephew, Wilhelm, at a certain point. So that might be the reason the boundary sort of comes around or curves around Mount Kilimanjaro. But once it's there, a boundary has a number of different effects. And what I've done is to compare the effects to a system of entropy. Where you create a boundary, you've created a difference. You might say, well, if you fly over it, you don't see a difference. You see a common ecology. Essentially, the environment is continuous. But it's a political difference. And it begins to generate dynamics of one sort or another. Now, obviously, one thing that happens is that goods are worth often a different amount of money on one side than on another. And so what you have is that difference creates a dynamic which is called the black market. You bring goods through and you sell them for more, and then you take something back. And of course, all the boundaries in Africa, not to mention North America, are filled with black market flows. And in some ways, that's okay. One of the items that's the most subject to the black market are livestock. Why? Because livestock carry themselves. If you have goods, you want to buy radios. There are flows of radios coming in through the Horn of Africa and other electronics, and they flow throughout Eastern Africa. You have to carry them. One thing about livestock is that you just drive them forward, so they carry themselves. And they are of substantial value, and therefore livestock that is sold in a place where the price is higher is a tremendous benefit. Over time, you've had a flow of livestock from Tanzania into Kenya, right through the Maasai areas, because the Tanzanian market tends to be suppressed in relationship to the Kenyan market. You also find a flow of livestock coming from Somalia through the pastoral regions of northern Kenya. Part of that is because the Somalis have a problem nowadays of governance, and of course there's conflict that continues there, and they know that there's a tremendous market in Nairobi. So Nairobi, as a capital city with millions of people, is, I used the term a magnet before for small towns. Now let me use it in a heightened way to describe the flow of livestock towards the major capital cities. And this is a flow that is international in nature. It once was that the Horn of Africa was the area of an outflow being pursued from Kenya into Somalia and then over to Saudi Arabia. Because especially during the Hajj, you had a tremendous need for camels and goats in particular. So they all flowed out. Then the Saudis, for animal health reasons, cut off the flow of live animals, and so that it's turned back. So I'm describing the way a frontier can create an entropic system where there is an incentive for there to be flows because there's some value established because of that difference. Now, these are not just economic. These can be, have to do with conflict. So one of the things that I did was to look at some of the conflicts in northern Kenya, in particular in Samburu district and Marsabit district, and its involvement in some of the peoples of southern Ethiopia. And there I was quite intrigued by a major conflict that occurred between the Dasanich of the Omo River Valley, the delta in Ethiopia, and the Gabra, who are a camel-keeping people who speak an Oromo language, who occupy a desert area of northern Kenya. Terrible conflict, and the Dasanich came and killed many people among the Gabra, people of all kinds. And I tried to figure this one out. I went and I interviewed people on the Gabra side and in the area where it occurred, and I went actually into Ethiopia. I found that I didn't really have the right papers. I went into Ethiopia and there was nobody at the border, so I kept going, and only at the town where I was actually heading did a police car appear and said, "What are you doing here?" And said, "Well, you should go back tomorrow," which was great because then I could have my interviews. And here's the story as I've understood it, using the frontier dynamic as sort of a metaphor for our understanding. Turns out that the rains come earlier along the coast of Lake Turkana than it does in the hinterland. So what you find is the Gabra, who are basically occupy the desert. When it comes earlier, the rain comes, they will come out to try to take advantage of the grazing along the lake. That's an area which has traditionally belonged to the Dasanich, although the Dasanich presence there has been affected by the creation of a national reserve called Kubifora, which some people might know because it's the site of very important paleontological findings. So the Dasanich came out, and they had, in effect, a sort of a square-off. The Dasanich said, "Why are you here?" etc. And they then accused the Gabra of stealing their goats, something like 10 or 20 goats. And the Gabra said, "We didn't steal those goats." And of course, one thing about the accusation of stealing a goat, you've got many different people in different homesteads. Who knows if somebody took some goats? There's no way to really know. And so this group said, "No, we didn't take any goats." The Gabra were told, "Return our goats by next Tuesday, or we will attack." Well, did the right people find out about that charge, etc.? Probably not. And then the Gabra were there. Then the Gabra moved their village. They went right back into Ethiopia where they had come from. People took a sigh of relief, said, "Okay." And then 2 days later at night, they came down and attacked. And it was dreadful. they basically wiped out this Gabra household. Okay, we can understand something about the ecology of resources. The fact that they had come out at a certain point because the rains had come earlier, they wanted to use that land, and they felt relatively impervious because they had recently been armed when the Ethiopian government had fallen and the soldiers from the previous government fled, and they sold their rifles because it was the only thing of value they had, and it was the Gabra who bought them. So they thought, and they Gabra had attacked the Rendili, who were immediately to the south, because they didn't have guns. Dasanich have guns, but the Gabra felt sort of proud and able to do that. So what we found was that the Dasanich used the frontier as a pivot. They came over, as they often do, so they're back and forth. They basically claim both areas. Then they went back, and then they came around, hit the Gabra, and then they started to make their way back. That's another story. The military came from Kenya, but in trying to attack the Dasanich, they in fact found themselves in sort of a swampy area, and so the military was killed, and all their guns and their uniforms were taken. So this becomes not just a local issue of livestock, it becomes an international issue of major proportion. Dasanich were on the other side, but the Dasanich, it turns out, and this came out of through our interviews, the worst thing they could imagine is that they have to stay in Ethiopia because their homes are in Kenya, and they don't want to feel they can't come back to Kenya. And yet they feel tremendous indignation against the Gabra. The Gabra, we told them, you should give back our goats by next Tuesday, and they didn't do it. They are the ones who are responsible for this. That's interesting, isn't it? The whole process whereby the guilt can be transferred back and forth. So ultimately, it became a diplomatic cause, célèbre, and finally they gave back the uniforms and the guns, and this was considered to be sufficient. And as far as I know, and I think I'm fairly well informed, nobody was ever charged in this, although there were about 45 people who were killed in that episode. So we see the border, the frontier, can be used as an incentive to attack. It can be used as a pivot point where you can attack and then you can go hide behind it as if it's a safe area. It's certainly a source of entropy in the sense that there are differences. Here, the differences of politics. There's differences of the value of livestock. You can get the livestock and take it back because wasn't just an attack on people. It was also a cattle theft, livestock theft. So the attempt, which is a very long-term question in anthropology and political science, of why in the world do pastoral peoples fight? Because they seem to be predisposed to violence, in particular to intergroup warfare. And I've been puzzling on this question for a long time. They are ready to fight. They have age-set battalions that are created, and what is a unit of a military entity there to do but fight? That's what they're trained to do. And so you have an internal dynamic, two different groups that sort of match one another. What are the immediate causes? Well, small affronts that are taken as major affronts. That would be one dimension. If you go down an explanation of why the so-and-sos attack the so-and-sos, we can find that they took one of our girls. Probably a seduction, but it's seen as they took one of our girls. Or they insulted so-and-so. That's unacceptable for us. In short, there's all these small things, personal things that blow up into a reason why people will attack. And of course, you have your foundational approaches, taking territory, looking for natural resources. Livestock, of course, is one that's an obvious case that people want to get livestock simply because it's a form of mobile wealth, as I mentioned before. So the move from a system where you have a territoriality between two different groups, and then you have an international border. The international border becomes much more firm, becomes usually straight. It usually has border guards, although pastoralists are well able to evade them. And it therefore creates many different opportunities and affordances. A recent book was published on the Horn of Africa talking about affordances, boundaries as affordances. Traditionally, boundaries have been described in Africa as major unfortunate experiences. If only Africa had not had all these boundaries created, or if they'd only put them in more sensible places. I'm not sure I know where a sensible place was. I described the line through the Maasai. Would that border between the Kenya and Tanzania have been better if they'd sort of bent around the Maasai and they were all in one state? I'm not sure. I'm not a proponent of that particular problem. I think any boundary, any frontier will have the dynamics that follow. In what we found in very recent work is that the Gare, who are a pastoral group that straddle the border between Ethiopia and Kenya, the Gare came into a major political issue when it was trying to be decided whether Moyale, which is a border town between Ethiopia and Kenya, should be part of the Somali region of Ethiopia or the Oromo region. And arguably it should be neither. It's a town that serves everybody. But they, for governance reasons, they had said we're going to govern our country on ethnic terms, and therefore we have to have it be in one side or the other. Well, they had a referendum. And what happened was that all the Gare from Kenya appeared in Moyale on the Ethiopian side to say, well, we're here to vote. Of course, we have a stake in this question. And so it was, the number appearing to vote was so much greater than what they had in their census that they then just called it off. And it's now, I think, it's a question in abeyance. But of course, they can also do that in the opposite direction. When the voting having to do with the county of Marsabit was taking place, there, because they had established the counties as an important unit of governance since 2010, the question is who would get, which groups would dominate. The dominant group in that entire county were the Oromos. You would have thought they would get the largest number of seats. Well, all the other groups formed a coalition to keep the Oromo out. And part of that was the Gare, who came in and basically supported that approach. So boundaries frontiers are very fascinating things. The establishment of a boundary depends not just on a line on a map, but a certain amount of political consensus on both sides. And so pastoralists have long interacted with each other in very pragmatic ways, such that boundaries are not the critical things, it's the resources. But the international and internal boundaries have really created a new set of dynamics that are engendering as much conflict as they are resolving. The theory of boundaries has often been put forward that where you have things that are vague and ambiguous, this is a source of basically a source of conflict. And where you have unambiguous lines, this helps resolve conflicts. My observation has been exactly the opposite. Where you try to create an unambiguous line, what you're doing is transgressing a whole series of rights that people on both sides have. And it's much better to allow for that sort of the comfort of ambiguity to be sustained, rather than trying to create an artificial certainty which just raises up conflicts, whether they be international or internal. There are two works that we've published as part of the Commission on Nomadic Peoples that I mentioned before, which have taken up in a transcontinental way and in a global fashion the questions of how pastoral systems work, and in particular the impact of boundaries. In collaboration with Pierre Bont, who is a noted French scholar in pastoralism, we published Herders, Warriors, and Traders, Pastoralists in Africa, which examined a number of case studies having to do with the effects of increased trade, population, creation of frontiers, and questions of conflict. Another work published by Philip Saltzman and myself, Nomads in a Changing World, examined conditions not just in Africa but also in the Middle East and Central Asia with regard to the changing world that impacts on pastoralists. And this, of course, the major effect is the state. States find pastoralists difficult. They often, as we were just illustrating, they often don't follow borders. They tend to transgress them and move across them. They're often, for obvious reasons, perpetrators of the black market because they're getting on with their lives. And of course, this is one of the things that people who are mobile can do. They can carry goods, and they're always carrying animals. And so we have a number of such dimensions of peoples that are being forcibly sedentarized by the state, or at least the state tries to sedentarize them. And you could look at the Maasai process of creating group ranches and then individual titles as a method whereby the state is making concrete, making fixed the settlement of pastoralists in a way that makes them much easier to control. There are many places where the state doesn't have much control over pastoralists. One could argue that Somalia essentially came apart as a state because you had very, very strong, resilient, and autonomous clan groupings that felt that they had been abused by the central state. So quite apart from the Islamic character of the current insurgency, much of the dissolution of the Somali state was essentially it being devolved into a lower level set of units that govern themselves because the state had, in their estimation, had been taking advantage of the pastoralists. So you have a very long set of tensions between nomads and the state. It was described by Ibn Khaldun some 1,000 years ago, looking at the Arabs of the nomadic Arabs and the Arabs of the cities, and we see it in, of course, the creation of states. There are states that have been created by great nomadic peoples, but they always go through a dynamic where the state itself that came out of a nomadic society, such as the Mongols, itself becomes the subject of further attacks. So we can ask ourselves, is that intrinsic to nomadism and pastoralism, or is it that the states are, in effect, trying to exercise force on peoples that are getting on with their lives and doing quite fine? Thank you.